and impediments. So the wisdom of youth lives within a real reality. But what do young people offer to Christian wisdom in particular? Who are they? What do they bring distinctly as young people? Even in this nativity scene, we see that Jesus was born into the world as a baby to a teenage mom. So that we already are aware that youth bear God's wisdom. Even in the story that's so central to our Christian faith, that is the birth, incarnation of Jesus Christ, is a birth, an incarnation that begins with the young. But what do we mean by the wisdom that young people contribute? Because young people live in a world fraught with challenges. Here are some statistics from the United States. The statistics in other parts of the world will be different. I'm not trying to be exhaustive. I simply want to give a little picture of some of the challenges in the world in which young people live. Poverty for United States children under 18 is 18%. That's almost 1/5 of the population. 50% of Black children in households headed by women are below the poverty line. 50% of Hispanic or Latino children are below the poverty line, and 33% of white children. So you see here that children of single moms are in great risk of being under the poverty line, and it's also racially connected, so that African American and Hispanic or Latino young people are more at risk than white children. Youth are victims of violence in the ages of 12 to 17, 14 out of 1,000 young people. And youth who are perpetrators of violence, 17 out of 1,000 young people. That's unacceptable. That is unacceptable. And if I could just do a little detour into the recent studies I've been doing with you, one of the things that African American young people say to me constantly when I ask them, what are your hopes for the future? They say, I want to create a world where African American young men can grow up to adulthood and where they will not end up in prison. Because the percentage of African American young men who grow into adulthood is strikingly low, and the percentage of African American young men who end up in prison between the time they're 17 and on forward is exceedingly high. So the young people themselves, when they talk about what their hopes are for the future, identify some of these statistics. They don't give the numbers. These numbers are not important. What's important is recognizing how risky some people's lives are. But we also live in a world in which God continues to act in people's lives. And I want to pause and spend a little time with you reflecting on this text from 1 Corinthians. Is there someone in the room who's willing to read it? Just from your seat would be fine. Someone?
I don't mind.
Oh, go for it. Thank you.
Where is the wise person? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. It is because of God that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption.
Thank you very much. I said we would begin by reflecting on wisdom. And when you go to the biblical text and the Christian tradition, you get a very mixed picture of what wisdom is and how highly it is valued. But could we look just at this text for a moment And what strikes you in this text? What jumps out at you? Yes.
It could be written today. It could have been written today.
Say it a little.
It could have been written today.
Yes. Yes. Others.
Perhaps that the wisdom of God is not among the people who have power, who are in high positions, or perhaps professors, and that the wisdom of God is among the weak, the poor, the people that used to be labeled foolish, perhaps. And
Good.
that's where God's wisdom is.
Good. Could you hear that back there? That the wisdom of God is not among the high and lofty, but it's among the lowly or the everyday people, even among those who are considered foolish. Anything else strike you in this text? Just look at the last line for a moment. What strikes you there? What strikes you? Is it working? What strikes you in the last line? Let's see if someone else, if no one else says something, I'm going to come back to you since then. Anyone else? You get to do it again.
Okay, the wisdom of God. Yes, it's our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. It's like the whole theology is in the wisdom of God. Everything that God does to us is in the wisdom of God, and that is among the poor people. The
Yes.
foolish.
Yes. Very, very good. Anyone else want to add to that? What strikes me in this text, and you find it in other texts, but this one is shows it really clearly. What strikes me is that there's a kind of there's a recognition that the wisdom of the world, the wisdom that we normally think of, is not quite what the same as God's wisdom. And then there at the end of the text, you discover that the wisdom of God is what is given to us through our relationship with God, through Christ Jesus. So it's because of God that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us the wisdom from God. So that Jesus is the wisdom from God to us, that is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. So we have a sense that wisdom comes in the relationship with God. It's not stuff that we have in our head, but it's our relationship with God that's marked by righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Now, we could do a lot more with this text and others, but this is just to give a kind of sense of how complex wisdom is in the biblical tradition. Wisdom emerges in a world in which God calls the people also to faith, hope, and love. And I'd like, again, someone to read this if you would. It's selected verses from 1 Corinthians 13, a very familiar text. Is someone willing to read this one? Yes, please.
If I speak in the tongues of mortals or of angels but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and And if I had all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's do the same with this one. What strikes you in this text about wisdom? The word wisdom doesn't appear, but what strikes you about wisdom? Yes. Can you just shout it out?
It's nothing without love.
Yes. Yes. What else?
There's a lot we don't know yet. That there's a lot we don't know yet.
Yes, a lot we don't know yet. Others. Yes.
I don't like this text because the sentence, when I became an adult, I put an end to the childish ways. So, Lord forgive us for this.
So tell me more about why you don't like the text, and
I
this, especially this
I
part.
like the child part of it, and I don't like that when we become an adult, that we put the childish way away.
That's great. That's good. I want to come back to that. Hold on to that thought. Anything else in this text that strikes you? Yes.
Then we'll see face to face.
Yes. We'll see face to face. There's more to come. So it's not putting down wisdom. There is, but it's saying we don't have it all yet. It's saying two things at least, a lot more than that. But it's saying what you said a minute ago, that it's nothing without love, and it's also saying that there's more to come. Anything else? Then I want to ask a different question, and it's going to start moving toward what you just said. What does it say about the wisdom of youth?
Can you please repeat that?
Shout it out a little bit, please.
Can you please repeat the question?
Repeat the question.
Yes, please.
What does it say about the wisdom of youth?
That we should put an end to it.
Yes, yes.
I don't think that it existed at the time this text was written, so I think it's skipping between childhood and adulthood. Because youth didn't exist at the time. I think it's saying put into the childish ways and become an adult at the time when we would say become a teenager.
That's an important cultural comment too. She made the comment that it talks about children and adults, but not about teenagers. And actually, in most cultures around the world, there was no youth, teenage period of life until the last 200 some years, because you went through childhood and then you went through a transition into adulthood. But you live in Norway in a culture, and I live in the U.S. in a culture, and most other Northern Hemisphere cultures. Most cultures around the world now do have a period that we identify as youth. So that's an important cultural comment as well as a comment about the text. I want to come back to this thing about putting an end to childish ways. It strikes me, I've always been struck with what you just said, your first question, the kind of wrestling that somehow when we become adults, it all makes sense and we get it figured out. But what struck me this time, because I was working on it, I was going back to this text as I prepared for today, and what struck me in the text is that it's not so much putting down children and children's wisdom, It's simply saying, communicating that we don't have it all yet. So it's reminding us that children, just like young children and older children and youth and young adults, are still growing. But this is reminding that everybody is. So on the one hand, it sounds to me also like it kind of puts down where children are. But then you can flip it on its side and say, maybe it's telling us that in fact we're all children. It's not that we who are adults are somehow have it figured out. We don't. But in fact, all of us are waiting for that time when we see God face to face. Yes.
And I think it's important to know that Paul does not say, when I was a child, Paul does not say that when I was a child, I saw him like in a mirror dimly. It says, now I see him in a mirror dimly.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. That's actually what struck me as I was working with the text. That maybe my assumptions about it had not noticed that before. Still a good question, don't get me wrong. I just think it's important for us to recognize that this text really puts into perspective the inadequacy of all of our wisdom. Which means that we're in it together with the youth. They have wisdom we don't have. We have wisdom they don't have. You have wisdom that you don't have. You have wisdom that you don't have. There's a sense that we're in this together, and only as God's future is unfolded will we begin to know God better. In the meantime, we can't trust our wisdom. This echoes the earlier text we just read. We can't trust our wisdom. We have to abide in faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Now, we're not exhausting these texts, but if someone wants to make a last comment, and if you'd like to make a last comment, I would welcome it. You want to push back?
No, of course, it's, I think it's just, text is there. It's focused, as we talked about here 2,000 years back. We discuss it here with the engagement, so that's important.
Anyone else? So when we talk about the wisdom of youth, what I'm suggesting is that we're talking about the wisdom of the children of God. And all children of God are in distinctive locations. Some are young, some are old, some live in Norway, some live in Africa, some in the US. The wisdom of the children of God. But I'm going to share with you 5 aspects of wisdom that I have discovered in young people as I've studied them for a great many years now, and as I've read others' works. And these are, I'm going to suggest that the wisdom of youth is in their hopes as children of God. The wisdom of youth is not in the stuff that's in their head. It's in their hopes as children of God, in their relationship with God. Just like our wisdom is in our hopes as children of God. These are 5 themes that for those of you who were there yesterday, I presented them briefly, but I'm going to be building on these today because that's the subject of today's seminar. The hopes are expressed, there are a lot of others that could be named, but these are 5 that I've heard recurringly as I study youth in congregational life and as I study youth through individual interviews and as I read the youth literature. Hope for the holy. Hope for community. Hope to understand themselves in the world. Hope for ethical guidance and hope to make a difference. So let's look at each of these individually. Hope for the holy. I'm going to share just a few quotes from some young people who live on the Navajo Reservation in northwest New Mexico in the United States. I chose these quotes because these young people live in a culture that is not the same as yours and it's not the same as mine. It's important to hear the voices of young people from different parts of the world and different cultures. But These young people reflect a kind of wonder that I also hear from other young people. And this wonder, oh, excuse me, I'm going to grab some water. Is this, can we use this? Thank you for this. The wonder is expressed by all of the young people I interviewed. I've interviewed at this point 47 for the most recent study, and I did congregational studies in 5 different congregations over a period of 1 to 2 years in each church. So I spent a lot of time listening to the voices of young people. And one young Navajo woman says, God is creator of all things, and I know this because of Jesus. My favorite Bible stories are about when Jesus was conceived and born. I thought Jesus was light in heaven. Before I went to church, I didn't know he was human. Now, this isn't a comprehensive theological statement. It's a statement of wonder. She had also always thought of Jesus as kind of abstract, light up there in heaven. And as she got to know the stories of Jesus, she began to encounter him as a human. And for her, that was awesome. She was awed by the incarnation. Another Navajo youth says, God is like a secret friend. I can't see God, but I can feel him. This expression comes from so many young people, from the UK, where I did some interviews, from Asia, and from the United States. This sense of God being in relationship with me. And I can't see God, but I can feel God. I know God is there. Another one says that she goes to God constantly in prayer, asking God for courage and strength. Another theme that I hear from the youth continually. And another one describes Jesus as the Great One, the Light. Those are just a few quotes, but they reveal something about young people's hope for the hope. And that hope is expressed in ritual practice, in prayer, and in formal or informal worship. A second kind of hope that young people express is a hope for community. Now, yesterday I had been asked to speak to the subject of learning in community, so I spent a lot of time on this particular subject. But today I want to share with you a story that comes out of Canada. This is the Joe Duquette High School. The Joe Duquette High School, you'll notice here in its mission statement, is also called the Saskatoon Native Survival School. The school is on the prairies of Canada, in a place where the Cree people, C-R-E-E, live and have been displaced by white folks who've come into Canada and settled over a couple of 100 years. And so there's a lot of brokenness in this community. In Canada, not a great number, but a few survival schools have been created by and for the native people, the indigenous people, so that they would have schools that would allow them to preserve their culture, to build their present community. And this is a little picture into one of those schools. There's a book about this one called Making the Spirit Dance Within. But this is the mission statement of the Joe Duquette High School. It's a healing place which nurtures the mind, body, and soul of its students. Our focus is on healing all members of the school family. Consequently, our philosophy expects a caring, a forgiving, and a believing environment. Now, this is not a religious school. This is an indigenous school. But for the indigenous people, religion is so deep in their bones. There's no way of binding the community together without recognizing the deep religious dimensions. And what they do in this school is pretty interesting. They have sweetgrass ceremonies regularly. I'm going to read you just a few of their practices to give you a sense. They have daily sweetgrass ceremonies in each classroom followed by a talking circle where they pass a talking rock from speaker to speaker around the circle. Are you familiar with this practice? It's actually a practice that's now become quite a frequent practice in peacemaking circles. And I think it's actually a really good practice for youth ministry, where people sit in a circle, and in this case, they do it every day, and they have a talking rock, and someone begins, and then when that person is finished, the person passes the rock to the next person, and then to the next, and to the next, so that everyone has a chance to speak, and if you don't want to speak, you simply receive the rock and pass it to the next person. And no one tells you how long you can speak. So if you have a lot to say one day, you speak a long time, and if you just want to say a sentence, you can say that. So it's a circle that allows people to say what they feel like they need to say. And that's a practice that this school practices every single morning. They also bring the elders in to share about the olden days, about the ceremonies, rituals, native practices that the young people have often not even encountered. They also go on a cultural camp every summer, and they do a lot with traditional ceremonies and traditional stories and so forth. They have an open admission policy. Everybody can be admitted, but they require attendance. And they require attendance because they believe that every person's presence is important, and the community is not complete without the presence of each one. So you'll see that many of the practices of this school are very open-ended, very open-minded. They allow young people to do what they need to do, but when it comes to attendance, it's required. They do a lot of other things, and I'm not going to name them all, but I do want to name two. One of them is that they have an infant care program, because they discovered that a number of the indigenous young women had children, and they were not married, and they had no one to care for their children. And if they were going to be in school, they needed a place for the children to be cared for. So this is a very non-judgmental environment, and they simply want to support every single student in the best way possible. So they created an infant care program. If they have students who are having trouble with alcohol, they create an alcohol program, and so on. They're constantly trying to respond to the needs of the young people who are gathered there. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that they have a parent council as well as a council within the government, so that they are trying to relate their work not just to the kids themselves, but also to the larger community. So that's an example of a school that has really taken community seriously and is attempting to heed the wisdom of the young people who hope for our community. Now, I'm going to say one further word about this that came from a study of a Roman Catholic parish in Los Angeles, California. Community is not always sweet and nice. The community that young people hope for is not necessarily a community of niceness. In this particular community, we had 3 of us who were doing the study, and we did it for a year, and we'd go visit youth gatherings, choir gatherings, worship services, and so on. And this was this was all Roman Catholic. It was a Roman Catholic parish. It was mostly African Americans. And one Sunday in worship, after the priest had preached the homily, after the priest had preached the homily, someone stood up in the congregation and said, "I don't appreciate what you just said," and started contradicting the priest. Well, one of our team was there that day, and he happened to be a very quiet, reserved white guy, and he came back to the team meeting the next week and said, "I think this church is really in trouble." So the next week he attended the youth service. Oh, thank you so much. The next week he attended the youth gathering on a Sunday evening, And he asked the young people, he was just listening, he was in the corner, and the young people got into this great, furious kind of debate about something. And they were talking loudly, they were going back and forth really hard. And the next week, when this team member came back to the group of researchers, he says, this church is about to fall apart. This church is in trouble. Well, one of the members of our team was a Latino woman who had grown up in a neighborhood similar to this African American neighborhood. She says, I don't think you got it right. You need to go back again, and you need to listen to what they say about their life and how they interpret what's going on. So the next time he went back, he started asking them questions. And he said to the young people, tell me, last week, or 2 weeks ago, you had a really loud discussion. It sounded like you were really angry with each other. What was going on? And one of the young women said, we do that all the time. We're family. That's what you do in families. You tell the truth to each other. You listen. You debate. You think it through together. You're willing to really disagree. And then the others started chiming in. And so then, as we continued our study of this parish, we discovered that what community means in this parish is full of intensity and fire. And so it's not always nice, and it takes different shapes in different communities. That's why I wanted to share with you an indigenous rural community and an urban Roman Catholic African American community. Community is not the same from place to place, but the hope for community runs through all of the youth and youth ministries that I have known. You may know some others though. Third is the hope to understand themselves and the world. And I ran across this quote from Aristotle that I thought was pretty cool. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. So even as far back as Aristotle, there was a sense that knowing yourself is a pathway to wisdom. And certainly young people want to know themselves. A story on this one comes from a study by one of my former students, now a professor, who led groups of young women. She led 5 different groups in different places, and she would bring them together and invite them to tell their faith stories to one another. She had developed a plan as to how to do that, and they would meet together over a period of 6 weeks, once a week, and in that period of time, they would share with each other their faith stories. They would listen and respond to one another, ask questions, and so forth. And these young people already knew each other when they came into these groups. But what she discovered is in every single one of the groups, at the end, the young people said, we've never talked to each other this way before. We've known each other for 5, 10, 15 years, and we've never had this kind of conversation. I shared that with you because they went on to talk about how they had come to know themselves better in the midst of these conversations. So that there's a kind of self-knowledge that we can actually encourage in young people. It doesn't always happen spontaneously. It sometimes does. But sometimes we need to find ways, like my friend found, to encourage young people to come together in a disciplined, intentional way to share their life journeys, their faith with one another, so that they not only come to know themselves better, but come to know one another better. So understanding themselves and the world. There's also a hope for ethical guidance, and here are three forms of ethical guidance that I've heard expressed in 3 different contexts. One of them is a town church. It's a part of the Reformed tradition in the United States, and it's a mostly white congregation, but it's also, it has people from other ethnicities as well. And in this church, which prides itself on being very liberal and letting everyone believe whatever they want to believe, when the young people talked about what they really wanted, they said, we really want to learn about war and peace. We want to study social issues, and we want to learn how to act in a Christian way. How can we be peacemakers? How can we be justice builders? That's what we want to learn. That's the kind of ethical guidance they wanted. And then in this same Roman Catholic parish that I mentioned to you before, they talked about wanting to learn how to be a welcoming church, to offer hospitality to people in the neighborhood, and to act politically in campaigns and other ways. And you see, this is an African American church with a lot of folks in it across the economic spectrum, but a fair number in this particular church are poor or working poor people, and they really want to be themselves a very hospitable church. They also want to act politically in the community. And then in a Midwestern rural Lutheran parish, the young people expressed the desire to learn how to live daily life in a Christian way. And I might add a little PS about this Midwestern Lutheran congregation, which actually, by the way, was down the road from a German congregation, Lutheran, Norwegian in origin, German in origin, but the one we studied was Norwegian in origin. And they did not want to join up with the German in origin church because they were too different. They wanted to preserve their Norwegian heritage, which I'm sure wouldn't look like Norwegian heritage to you, but it did to them. And they really wanted to hold on to it tightly. And but in this church, very small church, the adults had a practice of bringing the young people into responsible positions a little bit at a time. So when children were 5, they would give them little jobs around the church. And when they were 7 or 8, they'd give them other jobs around the church. And by the time they were 9 or 10, they were doing things with the younger children. By the time they were 13 and 14, they were leading parts of the worship service and helping to tend the church grounds and so on. You get the picture. They were basically socializing the young people, the children and young people, into caring for the church and living life daily as a Christian. So it's a very formation-oriented congregation. So these are 3 different forms of ethical guidance that the young people expressed as something really, really important to them. Now I'm going to pause just a minute because most of you are already engaged in youth ministry, and some of you for a long time. What forms of ethical guidance do you hear young people saying they want? Yes.
None whatsoever.
Oh, none whatsoever. Now that's interesting. Yes.
I had a group, actually mostly guys, coming to church, and we had this thing going on, we had set what we were supposed to talk about and everything for the next weeks, and then suddenly one of the guys, he just came out and then, hey, what do you think about this with alcohol and such? And it was just this open question where we could all sit together. None of us had really planned anything, but we used the whole hour to just talk about this. And then the same thing happened the next week after. And he was like, hey, what about sex? And then without condemning or saying things like this is how the church wanted to be, we could actually sit there and talk together about it.
I'm so glad you shared that, especially right after the comment about none. Because very often, and this is true in this county church, if you ask the kids, what kind of ethical guidance do you want? they'd say none. But if you hang out and you listen to what they say, and if you're present with them when those questions come up, they have a lot of things they want ethical guidance on. They don't necessarily want you, in fact, they almost never want you to tell them what to do. But they want you to help to be present as they sort these things out. So that one of the things I discovered in the interviews I did is that the young people very often talked about what they learned about living a Christian life from the people around them. And they also talked about what they wanted to unlearn about living a Christian life from the people around them. One of the points of conflict for a lot of the young people from different ethnicities and different parts of the U.S. was about sexuality and about homosexuality in particular, because many of them, even some who saw themselves as very conservative theologically, had a different view about homosexuality than their parents or their churches did. And so that was something they struggled with. Now, I don't know how those questions of sexuality play out here in Norway, although I understand they do play out in some way. But what I do recognize is that in the conversations that I hear from young people in our country, very often they express questions, number one, gratitude for what they do learn from people, if you ask them kind of quietly so they're not having to make a public statement about it. And thirdly, frustration when they're given answers that they can't accept. And they want to talk about those questions, but they don't find sometimes a lot of receptivity in their community. So if their church has a strong view on some subject and their own view is different, they feel caught because they want to be able to talk about their view, but they feel like nobody really cares or listens to it because their view is different from the dominant view in their church. Do you have that happen here? Does that sound familiar? And the subjects are not always the same. Sexuality, all aspects of sexuality are often one of the subjects. But another area where the young people often talk is the desire to think about how to relate with people of other faith traditions. And they often feel like they don't have a full range of options laid out before them. They often feel that they have just one option that's sort of the answer. And they want to ask the kind of questions that the kids were asking you. What do you think about alcohol? What do you think about sex? What do you think about relating with people of other religious traditions? And the last one is hope to make a difference. And I thought this quote from George Bernard Shaw was a very interesting one because it connects us back to wisdom. We are made wise not by the recollection of our past, but by the responsibility for our future. So wisdom is not what we have stuffed in our heads again, or how much we know about the past. But wisdom has to do with, if we look to 1 Corinthians, a relationship with God, out of which wisdom comes. And it has to do with our sense of responsibility for our future. And this is another theme that is huge for the young people. They really care about making a difference in the world. So when I would ask, what are your own hopes for your life? Or what are your hopes for the world? They would always have something to say. Sometimes they would say, as a couple of young women said, I just want to make other people's lives better. I want my life to be the kind where the people close to me have someone to listen to and someone to care for them, and they know that I care. For some people, it's a desire to keep all African American young men out of prison. So the visions of how to make a difference are quite wide-ranging, but the desire to make a difference is very consistent across the young people that I've studied and the young people about whom I read in the literature. So here are some visions for youth ministry that come out of these hopes. Youth ministry, the themes. Youth ministry is focused on transcendence. Youth ministry needs to engage young people with the holy. That has to do with worship, prayer. It has to do with just awe. When you're out hiking with young people and you just are in awe, but engaging young people with the holy. Communion, ministry that enacts community and guides people in living in community. It's not only important to build the sense of community among young people, but it's also important to help young people learn how to live better in community. There's nothing more wonderful than to see a young person in church who's rejected at school, who's mistreated at school, but who knows that the church family is home, who knows that the kids at the church are going to treat her or him differently. That's a sign that people are learning to live intentionally and well in communion, not just in community, but in communion. Wisdom, ministry that inspires and equips youth to engage in meaning making. And I would suggest that the very comments you made about just being handy when they ask a question is a way of engaging them in meaning making. Another example is the one I shared with you about my friend who had these different groups of young women in which they shared their faith stories and their faith questions. She was engaging them in meaning making. One of the things that I've heard the most critique from young people is frustration with the church that doesn't allow them to ask questions. Very, very often, the young people love their churches, but they are really frustrated and sometimes angry that the church doesn't create spaces or even allow spaces for them to ask some of their hard questions. Faithfulness, ministry that encourages and equips youthful for faithful living in every aspect of their lives. And that's not only offering guidance, but it's being available to listen as they seek to answer those questions about ethical living themselves. And then finally, vocation, ministry that engages youth in recognizing their present vocation and discerning their future. You remember the town church I mentioned? Well, the youth in that town church, during the 2 years we studied that church, decided that they did not like the way the library was dealt with at their church, at their high school. So most of these kids were in the same high school, and their library was closed except for a very few hours each day. And they felt like that was really unfair. They went to the principal of the high school and they protested, and nothing happened. And so the young people of this church got themselves together and got other young people together to do a sit-in the library until the principal changed his mind about how the library would operate. Now that's an immediate vocation, because for these young people, they saw that as a Christian act. They thought they were improving their school, and they were doing it as Christians. Then they were involving other young people in the action. But other young people talk about how they were able to listen to a friend who was in trouble. So their vocation is immediate and present. It may be public, as in the school story. It may be individual, just the way they engage with their friends. But it's immediate. And it's also often the future. So they're discerning their future, and vocational discernment is a really important part of youth ministry. So my visions that I'm suggesting to you that come out of these hopes of young people are visions for transcendence, communion, wisdom, faithfulness, and vocation. And before, I'm going to leave this slide on, but before I throw it open to you again, I want to share with you some of the theological roots of these visions. Just one second. Youth yearn for the holy because they are already awake to the presence of God. So the yearning for the holy and transcendent youth ministry is grounded in the theology of God's presence. Youth yearn for community because God is holy community, expressed by Christians in the Trinity, and also because God calls people into covenantal community with one another and with God's creation. So the yearning for community and the building of youth ministry that is focuses on communion recognizes that God in God's self is community, Holy Trinity, and that God calls people into holy communal living, covenant. 3, youth yearn to understand themselves in the world because God is wisdom, and wisdom was present with God in the beginning of creation, Proverbs 9, and in the ongoing creation of the world. So youth ministry that focuses on wisdom and encourages wisdom recognizes, is built on a theological foundation of God as wisdom. 4, youth yearn for ethical guidance because God provides a cloud to guide people by day and a pillar of fire by night. Because God is a God who calls people into ethical living and who provides guidance. So the youth ministry that focuses on faithfulness is youth ministry that recognizes, is grounded in a God who expects the people to be faithful and who provides support and guidance for the faithfulness of the people. And finally, youth yearn to make a difference in the world because God has been creating from the beginning of time and promises to create the future, new creation. And God calls human beings into the vocation of enjoying and participating in God's work. So, youth ministry that focuses on vocation recognizes that God has created, is creating, and will create, and God expects us to enjoy and participate in that creative holy work. So all of these visions are grounded in theological assumptions, but theological assumptions that run deep in Christian tradition. Now let me throw this open and invite you to add your own visions for youth ministry. You're welcome to push back on any that I shared too, or to add to them. Yes?
Thank you very much. Danse, inte sin egen som tog. Actually, I was speaking Greek to you now, saying hello, my name is Uwe.
Sorry? I'm going to go real fast.
Danse, inte sin egen som Tore. I'm saying, hello, my name is Tore. In Cree, actually. You're referring to First Nations peoples in North America. And I'm an indigenous Sami from Norway. And it was interesting to listen to you. And I think it is, you were referring to indigenous people, indigenous youth on the first 2 items. And I don't think that is accidental, actually. The first one was on the holy, the other on community. And I think it is important also for us to understand that the hopes and the wisdom of youth, as with any other people, is also heavily informed by our cultural worldviews. Actually, I'm having a workshop later today on having the earth as our identity. I think it is, to put it another way, I think it is a challenge in a very individualized culture as is in the society, how do we inform the hopes and the yearnings for the youth in directions that are also viable and sustainable theologically, also for the future of planet Earth. Yeah.
I'm really grateful that you shared that. I just want to say bravo and thank you for that. And I do find it striking that the yearning for the holy and the yearning for community are expressed by dominant groups of young people, but they don't have they don't always have the resources in their immediate visible present to be able to tap as in on this Navajo reservation and in this tree school. So thank you very much for that. Yes.
I just focused a little bit on what you said with this youth that I wanted to help or feel like they participated in the community where they sat in at the library, or I just listened to my friend today, that they need to feel like they did something. They put a lot of work in this helping others and being a part of something bigger, and especially like you said, in this individual world that we live in, we're supposed to live for ourselves and make ourselves the best we can. Sometimes maybe helping others is better or feels better, and to give our youth an option or a place where they can come and contribute to the society is important.
That's very, very helpful, and also to recognize with them how important what they've done is. It's really hard. It's easy for young people to think, well, that's just what I do. It's easy for adults to think the same thing. But actually, those actions build a habitus or a habit of living that builds into a community of discipleship. Others? I do think that Tour has added one that's not there, and I want to underscore it. He's added the natural world into this picture. And it's interesting that the young people don't often name that when I ask them what they care about most. But they often do say, when I ask them, where have you had your deepest spiritual experiences? They often speak about their experiences in the natural world. So I think that's missing from this list. The youth ministry that connects young people in covenant relationship with all of creation, and not just with other humans. Anything else that you want to add? Yes.
I think they want community, but one of the big challenges, I think for a lot of kids or youth in Norway, is that they're very busy. There's so much that needs their attention. Sport activities, different activities, school, the media, or their phones and stuff. So how can we talk about that community also in some sort needs time, and that we need to have time together to form community?
Does anybody want to answer that one?
I don't want to answer, but can I continue?
Yes, you may.
Should I wait?
Shout it out.
Okay. I completely agree with it, but I also think you said that in the community with the church, they can be away from what their school is, and but in a lot of places in Norway, like where I live, the community that they're in school is the exact same as in the church, because we have small communities. So the person that they are is always affected by the person that other people see in school, also in church. And I think that also comes into the same problem as having time, but when they have time, it's limited. And then they're with the same people that they're in school or on the football field or, yeah, and that's the problem.
That's actually really helpful, and it adds a different dimension. Let me make a comment on this one and then connect it back to this one. I think that time is huge. That's also true in the United States. And some of the communities that do it best are communities that are ethnic minority, meaning that within the general population, this particular ethnic community is smaller than others. So, for example, Korean American churches often create more opportunities for time because people come together on several hours on Saturday and several hours on Sunday because that's their time just to be themselves and not have to interact with all the other aspects of society. But people from the dominant culture, our cultures, have more trouble doing that, and it's a huge issue. There are a lot of ways we can create pockets of time, however. Retreats, mission trips, summer camps, and so on, that provide a kind of time away. And what can happen in those moments can carry on into the more hectic, busy daily life. But I do think we have to address that issue of time. It's huge. And I want to pick up on the comment you made in a different way, but I don't have answers for any of these questions. You realize I'm thinking it with all of you. But a lot of the young people I interviewed, and this was young people from all over the US and about a few of them were in the UK. Most of the kids that I interviewed talked about having a church community and a school community, so different from what you're talking about. That's especially true for kids who live in urban or suburban areas. But they felt like they could be more themselves at church, which was interesting and uplifting, than at school, because there were ways in which the church was nurturing their common life in a way that was more meaningful to them. That was frequently said. However, I don't think we nearly tap what we could be doing in churches. I think there's so much more we could be doing in churches and also in other organizations to cultivate intentional community life that is compassionate, respectful, question posing, honest, and so forth. And that, I think, even in the kind of community you're talking about, where they're with the same kids all the time, I do think in that kind of a community, it's worthwhile for the church leaders to ask themselves, and this includes the youth themselves, the youth leaders, ask themselves, what do we need to do differently when we're in church together in order to nurture the kind of community of disciples we think we're called to be? And there are some pretty startling examples of young people who are special needs kids, who have learning disabilities, psychological challenges, and others who can find home in a church when they can't find it anywhere else. So how do we cultivate that? And how do we engage the young people in thinking about how to cultivate that? Anyone else want to jump into this mix? Yes.
Last year, I think, there was presented research in Norway. Last year, some scientists from University of Oslo presented research from Norway, saying almost exactly what you say now. That one of the factors that young people identify as very positive for their church life is that they can be themselves. But they greater degree than school or the football team or whatever. One other thing, I think that the Church of Norway is a very diverse church. parents are not a church. Teenagers are not either. And I think this is about relevance. How is our church relevant for teenagers and their parents? Because they love the church as they love their house, church house, but not necessarily the congregation.
That's very good. And thanks for adding that research from Norway. That's interesting because that corresponds with what I discovered also. That often the churches provided something special that was not provided as well in some other settings. But I want to say not only is the question, is the church relevant, but also is the church faithful? And kids are so angry when they see the church being hypocritical. And of course the church is always hypocritical because we're just human beings after all. So living in the tension of being called and yearning to be faithful and seeking to follow Jesus and knowing that we fall short is always going to be there. But the youth feel it too. So can't we at least share our vulnerability with them instead of pretending that we've got it figured out and we're going to show them the way and that we're right? I'm exaggerating a little bit now.
I want to thank you for an interesting seminar. I'm just wondering, when you interview these youths, whether some of these values that you are describing, that they find more important to find their places in the youth ministry. That they find more important to find their places in the ministry. You have 5 values that you describe. That's important for them. Are there some difference between them? That some more of them think this is important for me, and I have to find a place in the congregation?
That's a really important question. And one of the things I want to say to you is that the young people I interviewed and the young people we studied in these congregations were ordinary. We weren't looking for the outstanding leaders. We weren't looking for the people who had the highest ideals. They were just ordinary kids. And the conversation would often start out with something like, I don't have anything to say. That kind of thing. And by the end of the conversation, I never had an experience where a young person didn't say something by the end. That was really fun. Or, I kind of liked it. Or, I really like this. I've never talked with anyone about this stuff before. So on a scale, the responses were altogether positive. They wouldn't always be, this was maybe just good luck. But some of them were kind of low-key and others were extravagant. The reason I share that with you is that these kids were just ordinary and they still expressed these high ideals. They also expressed that they felt like they fell short and the people around them fell short. So they always felt like they were, they really cared about what could be, and they recognized that there was some messiness in their lives and in the lives of those around them that worried them a lot. Does that respond to you at all? Somehow that idealism has to inform our practice of youth ministry without our dealing with ideals as if we're going to bring them off or we're going to make them happen. Because we're not. We're human, the kids are human, we live in human churches, human congregations, but the source of all wisdom and all hope is God. And if we can trust in that, then our best efforts will bear more fruit. And our worst efforts hopefully will be redeemed by the work of God. If not in the immediate present, over time. What I want to do now is to move into the last phase of this seminar. We have about 15 minutes. So are you ready to take a deep breath and move into the next phase? Is that okay? So the question is, how do we walk with youth in complex realities? And in a way, that's exactly what we've just led into. We're talking about complex realities. the complex realities of young lives and the complex realities of our own and our churches, but these are complex realities that are held in the hands of God. The labyrinth, I think, is a really helpful symbol of this journey, because in the labyrinth, do you walk labyrinths in Norway? In the labyrinth, you walk, and you meditate as you go, and you walk into the center, and then you walk back out. So as we walk with young people in complex realities, there are going to be moments when we walk into the center. Moments when we say, that was a God moment. It might be when the kid says, what do you think about alcohol? What do we think about alcohol? What do we think about sex? It might be a moment when a young person says, I'm really worried about so-and-so because she's having a rough time right now. So there are times we walk into the center. There are times when we stand in awe of God and we know that God is here in this moment, in this place. But there are moments when we walk back out. So there's a kind of movement in and out as we walk this journey. What's important for us, I think, is to seek the larger common vision that tugs us in youth ministry. And I'm going to introduce you to one last set of thoughts today. This comes from the leadership literature. I'm taking off my shoes because they're killing my feet. Communities, the leadership literature recognizes that at one point in history, many communities were more convergent. That is, people were more alike, more homogeneous. And increasingly, communities are becoming more divergent. That is, people think different things, and they often disagree strongly. So for leaders of those communities, and I'm now talking about youth leaders, if we're going to be flexible and imaginative, if we're going to lead communities that are agile and purposeful, we're going to have to be flexible and imaginative. So that requires something of us as leaders with young people. A convergent environment is one in which the question is the same for everyone and the answer is the same, such as, where is your church located? So you're sitting with a group of people all in the same church and you say, where's your church located? The question is the same for everybody and the answer is going to be the same because they know the address of the church or they can give something that's close to them. A divergent environment is one in which the question is the same for everyone, but the answers are different. For example, what is the mission of your church? So if you ask a group of young people, what is the mission of your church? Or what is the mission of the youth ministry in this church or in this organization? You're going to have a lot of different answers probably. That's a divergent environment. Now, let me go back up to this one first. Obviously, it's much easier to do youth ministry in a convergent environment when everybody believes the same thing about everything and everybody's in easy harmony with one another. But a divergent environment is one that creates tensions, like the African American parish that I mentioned, where people would get into these arguments. But in their situation, the young people and the leaders, the adult leaders, understood that that was just the way they acted as family. And so they accepted that as part of the reality. I'm going to suggest that not only do we have convergent and divergent environments in youth ministry, but we also have the potential for transvergence. Now, I made up this word, and I thought I was really clever. And then I started Googling it, and I discovered that other people had made it up also. So this word is actually used in a variety of ways in physics and all kinds of places. But it's not a common word in English. The idea, though, is to imagine a transvergent environment, which means another alternative. So very often we get caught up in how can we be more convergent or how can we deal with the divergence. And I'm suggesting that maybe it's not either or. Maybe it's possible to create yet a new kind of environment, a new kind of youth ministry. So my play with this word transvergence led me to the Urban Dictionary, which I found online, and it has two forms of transvergence. One is the adjective, which is transvergical. Now, isn't that a cool word? So now you know a new English word that not very many people know. But the way they define it is an unexpected outcome to an expected event, or being on the brink of a paradigm shift and expecting one outcome when another totally different but similar scenario juxtaposes the situation. So in other words, you're going along, and everything looks like it's going the way it went last year at the same time, and suddenly something new breaks through. Or maybe one of the kids says, you know, we could do this differently. And suddenly you find yourselves all talking about, well, how could we do it differently? So transvergence is moving towards something new. The verb form is the process of coming to the point of break. This is one reason why that Roman Catholic parish was so healthy. It was a very vigorous parish, very lively. One of the reasons it was healthy is because people were willing to live with tension. And in that case, they could live with high levels of tension. That wouldn't work in every culture, but it worked for them. But moving to the point of break. So let's take the issue of time. So what if you problematize the issue of time? And you say, okay, how can we do it differently? So that we're not allowing busyness to prevent us from being together, from worshiping God, from taking time for silence, meditation, fun, play. Transvergence is the looking for something new, a new option. So a transvergent environment is one in which both the convergent and divergent realities exist, but the organization or community is pulled toward a larger transcending vision that can be shared in spite of radical differences. And this is part of what I had in mind when you mentioned the kids in your small community that are with the same kids at church and at school. Is the church in that setting, is it possible for the church in that setting to ask, is there something else we can do? Is there another way we can be as church? So that when the kids come to the church, they have the opportunity to see a new way of being in the world. I think that's our challenge in youth ministry. I think that's our challenge in all of ministry, is to ask ourselves, what new thing is God doing? God is doing a new thing. Do you see it? Transvergence is the opening yourself to see the new thing God is doing and the new thing God is calling you to do. With transvergence, a community is pulled toward paradigm shifts that no one knows in advance. The unexpected new direction that breaks through and claims the community for the next moments of time. Now, these can be any number of different things. One of the churches in Southern California that was aging and getting small and diminishing in size became frustrated because they felt like they didn't have the liveliness they used to have. And almost everyone in the congregation was 70 or over. So they thought, do we just sit here and wait until we all die off? Or is God calling us to do something different? And someone in one of the group discussions one night said, what do you think we could do? And before you knew it, they were having a conversation in which they said, well, we're all retired. We all have time to give. So this little tiny congregation of elderly, I won't say elderly, but people from 70 on, decided that they would give their time. The schools in their community were going downhill fast. They lived in a community that was really struggling in terms of poverty and other kinds of social issues. So they decided that they would volunteer in the local schools. They would, and they created an after-school program. They led in games, music. They worked with the kids in homework. They did tutoring. They did all kinds of things. And before you knew it, this church was alive again. And
some of these kids actually started coming to the church, but they were not doing it to bring the kids into the church. What they were doing it for is to respond to what they thought was God's call in their life, to use what they did have, which was time, in service to the young. So this local congregation stopped thinking of themselves as old folks waiting for the church to die. They started thinking of themselves as a church with 200 kids because they were interacting with 200 kids every week. Someone in the congregation was interacting with some of those kids every single weekday. So that was transvergence. They simply asked questions and paused and prayed until an insight broke forth. And that's what we can do in youth ministry. So what are some of the practices we can engage for building youth ministry in a transvergent way? I'm going to just list these really fast. I'm not going to do much with them. We can listen and learn. Listen to young passions for God and for mission. Listen to young visions and dreams. Listen to their deep and enduring hurts. We can lead. Lead from the depths of your own being, which includes trusting God and the God nudges in your life. Sometimes transvergence comes to us as a kind of God nudge. It's easy not to pay attention to those. But leading is paying attention to them. Leap. Leap into experimenting. I should have put experimenting here. But part of the leadership literature suggests that high energy inspires energy in others and draws people together to develop and enact vision and solve problems rather than just to fill gaps. So high energy is often characteristic of people in youth ministry, but leaping means that you're experimenting. You're willing to try something new for a week or a month or 3 months. And if it doesn't work, you're going to try something different. But it's a way of just opening yourselves to what God might be doing in a new way that you might not notice if you don't open yourself to leap. Link. That is, build community among the young people in all kinds of ways, not just linking people in serious kind of conversations, but trying to engage in youth ministry that links people through the arts, through play, through sport, through prayer, through worship, through meditation, through all different kinds of Christian practices, some of which are fascinating, and the young people have never had a chance even to know that they exist. And lift, that's not a good picture for what I intended, but I couldn't find another one like when I was looking. But lift has to do with lifting people with physical help, and it has to do with lifting people with prayer and presence with one another. The reason the picture of the prayer I really like, but it's all older people, and I needed to find one with young people. But it doesn't hurt for youth to see older folks engaged in that kind of prayer with one another as well. Lean. We need to let young people lean on us, and at times we need to be willing to lean on them. And now it's your turn. You have 2 minutes to add your own practices that you think you might want to throw into the mix as we close. You can just shout out simple words and phrases if you wish. Or you can build on or fuss about one of the ones I put up.
To hang out with young people.
Great. Hang out. Good. Others?
I don't think you can say listening too many times. I don't think you can say listening too many times.
Can't say listening too many times. And that's another one of those challenges of time, because it's not just the kids who are busy, we're also busy. And it's so easy not to listen. Yes. 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 Very good. Anyone else? Yes.
So that means
Yes. Yes. Two more. Yes.
Eat dinner with them and help them with their homework.
Yes. Yes. These are wonderful, and I hope you just keep sort of thinking them through and sharing them with one another. Thank you very much for your participation in this, and I've learned a lot from you, and I wish you well in your ministries. Thanks a lot.